Somewhere in the world right now, someone is opening a bottle of Johnnie Walker. Music. Maybe it's a toast at a wedding in Lagos. Maybe it's a lonely drink in a Tokyo bar at midnight. Maybe it's sitting unopened on a shelf in your own house. That striding man in the top hat looking back at you. Here's what almost nobody knows when they crack that seal. The man whose name is on the bottle never drank a single drop of it. Not one. Not ever. John Walker was a teetotaler, a man who built an empire out of something he refused to taste. Music. And that's not even the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is that this whole thing, this brand that now sells over 220 million bottles a year in more than 180 countries, more than any other Scotch whiskey on earth, started because a 14-year-old boy's father died and there was nothing else to do but grow up fast. No trust fund, no mentor, no plan. Just grief, a small farm, and a very Scottish sense of stubbornness that said, fine, we'll figure it out. Let's go back. Not to 1820 when the story officially begins, but a year earlier to 1819, on a modest tenant farm called Todrigs, just outside a town called Kilmarnock in Ayrshire, southwest Scotland. Music John Walker was born on the 25th of July 1805 at Todrigs Farm near Kilmarnock. Picture the world he was born into. Napoleon is still fighting across Europe. Britain is an agrarian, class-locked society where a farmer's son is basically guaranteed to become a farmer or a labourer or nothing much at all. Kilmarnock itself was a modest weaving and market town, respectable, industrious, unglamorous. Nobody in it was destined for a global legacy. That's important to hold on to because so much of what follows only makes sense if you remember. This was not a story that was supposed to happen. Then in 1819, John's father died. John Walker's father died when John was still a young teenager. In 1819. John was 14 years old. Sit with that for a second. 14. In our world, 14 is a kid worrying about exams and friend groups. In 1819 rural Scotland, 14 with a dead father meant something closer to, you are now, functionally, one of the adults responsible for your family's survival. There was no welfare state, no safety net. What there was a farm. And farms, when a father dies, generally get sold. After his father's death, the Walker family sold off the farm and used the proceeds to fund a grocery and warehouse business. The exact number varies a little between sources. Some say £417 held in trust. Others put the sale nearer £537, but the amount barely matters. What matters is this: a family's entire life, generations of working that soil, got converted into a lump sum, and that lump sum became the seed of everything. The trustees invested the proceeds in an Italian warehouse, grocery and wine and spirits shop on the high street in Kilmarnock, Ayrshire. An Italian warehouse, by the way, that's not a translation error, it's just what these shops were called at the time. They sold imported goods, dried fruits, oils, spices, teas, wines, fancy, cosmopolitan-sounding stock for a small Scottish town. And Walker began managing the grocery, wine, and spirit side of it as a teenager in 1820. So here's our real starting image, not a triumphant entrepreneur striding into his glorious future. A grieving teenage boy standing behind a counter trying to keep a shop from collapsing, because if it collapses, his family has nothing left. That's the actual birth of Johnnie Walker. Not ambition, necessity. Now here's where it gets interesting, because this is where you start to see who John Walker actually was underneath the tragedy. Every grocer in Scotland at the time sold spirits. That was completely normal. Most shop owners of the day stocked single malts, but the quality and taste were wildly inconsistent from cask to cask. Think about what that actually meant for a customer. You'd buy a whiskey today, love it. Come back next week, buy the same whiskey, and it would taste completely different. Distilling in the early 1800s was closer to alchemy than science. No standardization, no quality control boards. Every batch was a gamble. Most grocers just shrugged and sold what they got. That was the accepted reality of the spirits trade. John Walker didn't shrug. This wasn't good enough for John, so he started blending spirits together to create a whiskey that tasted just as good every single time. Now, where does a teenage grocer learn to do that? This is one of my favorite details in the whole story because it's almost never given the weight it deserves. Grocery shops in 19th century Scotland didn't just sell whiskey, they sold tea. And tea, like whiskey, varied wildly in quality depending on the harvest, the region, the shipment. John Walker could expertly blend tea, a skill that translated directly to whiskey blending. Think about that for a moment. The single most consequential decision in the history of Scotch whiskey, the decision to blend rather than sell single malts raw, didn't come from a distiller. It came from a tea merchant's instinct, applied sideways to a completely different product. The man who would give his name to the world's best-selling Scotch whiskey wasn't even primarily a whiskey man in his own head. He was a grocer solving a consistency problem, the same way you'd solve it with tea leaves. And here's the detail that turns this from a nice business anecdote into something almost darkly ironic. The man doing all this tasting, blending, adjusting, perfecting, John Walker himself, was a teetotaler. It's rumored, though never fully confirmed, that he never drank alcohol at all throughout his entire life. Think about the sheer discipline in that. He built his reputation, his livelihood, his family's future, on a product he refused to consume, not through hypocrisy, but through pure professional discernment. He didn't need to like whiskey to understand it. He needed to understand what consistency meant, what quality meant, and he applied that understanding with the same coldly precise attention a jeweler gives to a stone he'll never wear. There's a kind of quiet tragedy underneath that too if you let yourself sit with it. A boy who lost his father at 14, thrown into adult responsibility before he was ready, builds a life around exact control, over blend, over batch, over consistency, in a world that had just proven to him, brutally, that nothing else in life could be controlled at all. I'm not going to tell you that's definitely what was going on in his head. Nobody can know that. But it's a thread worth noticing. By 1825, Walker, still a teetotaler, was selling a full range of spirits, rum, brandy, gin, and whiskey. But before long, he shifted to dealing mainly in whiskey. The Exile Act of 1823 had just relaxed brutal old distillation laws and slashed the crushing taxes that had strangled the industry for decades. Suddenly, whiskey was becoming a real, legitimate, growing business, not just moonshine and smuggling. Walker had positioned himself right at the front edge of that shift, almost by accident, almost by instinct. His product went by a plain, unglamorous name back then, Walker's Kilmarnock Whisky. No striding man, no fancy label, just a local grocer's name on a local product, sold to local people who trusted him because, unlike everyone else on the street, his whiskey tasted the same, bottle after bottle, year after year. Now, I promised you this wouldn't be the polished, sanitized version. So let's talk about 1852. A disastrous flood tore through Kilmarnock and destroyed almost all of Walker's stock. Imagine building something for over 3 decades, your whole adult life, one careful blend at a time, and then watching a river do in a single night what no competitor, no economic downturn, no bad harvest had managed to do. Everything gone. Barrels, bottles, years of inventory, swept away or ruined. This is the part of the story that gets skipped in almost every glossy retelling, and I think that's a mistake, because it tells you something essential about who these people actually were. Walker didn't fold. The business recovered within a couple of years. No dramatic comeback speech, no legend, just grinding, rebuilding, restocking, going again. That's not the kind of thing that makes for an exciting Hollywood montage. It's just what people who have already survived losing everything once at 14 know how to do a second time. By now, Walker was older, married. He'd wed Elizabeth Purvis in 1833, respected in the town, a leader of the local trade association, and a Freemason. He wasn't some scrappy outsider anymore. He was an institution in Kilmarnock. But whiskey, even his good, consistent whiskey, was still only a side dish. Under John Walker, whiskey sales represented just 8% of the firm's total income. Let that number sink in, because it tells you the man never got to see what his name would become. He died believing he ran a grocery shop that also happened to sell decent whiskey. When John passed away in 1857, after a full and prosperous life, he left his son Alexander a very healthy business. A healthy business. Not a whiskey empire, just a solid, respectable Kilmarnock grocery with a nice little sideline that tasted the same every time. If the story had ended there, you would never have heard of John Walker. There would be no bottle on your shelf, no striding man, no global brand. The truth, and this is the part that I think has real emotional weight, is that John Walker built the foundation and never got to stand on the building. Here's where the story shifts from quietly admirable to genuinely strategic. Alexander, or Alec, Walker, John's son, had not spent his youth behind the family counter. He'd been sent away to apprentice with a tea merchant in Glasgow. There he learned the art of blending tea professionally, a formal version of the exact instinct his father had stumbled onto years earlier. When he came home to take over his ailing father's business, he brought that trained expertise home with him, and he used it to reshape the whiskey, refining it into what would eventually become Old Highland Whiskey, the blend that generations later would be renamed Johnnie Walker Black Label. But blending better whiskey was only step one. Alec understood something his father, the careful, cautious grocer, may never have fully grasped. This wasn't just a product problem anymore. It was a business model problem. He persuaded his father to abandon the narrow world of grocery retail altogether and go into wholesale trading, sourcing whiskey from all over Scotland. Campbelltown whiskey from the Kintyre Peninsula, smoky Islay whiskey, grain whiskey from patent stills, and Speyside Glenlivat-style whiskey. This is the moment the operation stops being a shop that sells whiskey and starts becoming a whiskey company that happens to have started as a shop. Then came the law that changed everything for the entire industry. The Spirits Act of 1860, which finally legalized blending grain whiskies with malt whiskies, ushering in the modern era of blended Scotch. Before this, blending malt and grain together in this way had been restricted. Blended whiskey, lighter, smoother, more approachable than a raw single malt, had been operating in a grey legal zone. Blended Scotch, being lighter and sweeter, was more accessible and marketable to a much wider audience than the harsh, inconsistent single malts most people were used to. Andrew Usher of Edinburgh gets historical credit as the very first to produce a true blended whiskey. But the Walkers followed close behind, and they followed it all the way to global dominance. Now, if you're the son of a man who watched a flood destroy decades of stock and who lived through the constant physical risk of glass bottles breaking during transport, you start thinking about logistics differently. And in a classic move of Scottish practicality, Alexander looked at the standard round whiskey bottle everyone used at the time, a bottle that blended in on crowded shelves and wasted precious space in every crate shipped overseas, and decided to change the shape entirely. In 1860, he introduced the brand's now iconic square bottle. Square bottles meant more product fit in the same crate space and dramatically fewer breakages during the long, rough journeys by ship and rail. This wasn't decoration. This was engineering disguised as branding, a shape chosen for cargo efficiency that accidentally became one of the most recognizable silhouettes in the history of consumer goods. And then the label. Since that same era, the label has been applied at a deliberate 24-degree upward angle, left to right. A tilt that allowed the text to be printed larger and read more easily from a distance than a flat, straight label ever could. Every design decision, notice, traces back to the same obsession: consistency, durability, visibility. Nothing about the early Johnnie Walker aesthetic was art for art's sake. It was function first, always. In 1865, Alec created the brand's first true commercial blend and named it Old Highland Whisky, formally registering it in 1867. The numbers tell the rest of the story on their own. Under John Walker, whiskey had made up just 8% of the firm's income. By the time Alexander was ready to hand the company down to his own sons, that figure had climbed to somewhere between 90 and 95%. A grocery shop had, within one generation, essentially become a whiskey company that occasionally sold groceries as an afterthought. There's a quote from Alexander Walker that I think deserves to be spoken out loud on this channel because it's the single clearest statement of the family philosophy that ever survived on paper. An Australian sales agent had written in, pressuring him to cut prices to compete with cheaper rival Scotches flooding the market. Alexander's answer: "With regard to the different brands of whiskey which you mention, they may for a time detract from the sale of JW&S. But we are determined to make our whiskey, so far as quality is concerned, of such a standard that nothing in the market shall come before it." Read that again. Not, let's match their price. Not, let's cut a corner just this once, temporarily. He accepted losing sales in the short term, rather than compromise the standard his father had built by pure instinct, decades earlier, in a small shop on a Kilmarnock high street. That single letter has been treated ever since almost like the company's unofficial constitution. Here's a piece of this story that almost never makes the highlight reel, and honestly, it might be the wildest part of the whole thing. To make a great blend, you need great single malts to blend from, and in 1893, the Walkers set their sights on securing one of the finest, a Speyside malt called Cardew, deep in the hills above the River Spey. Except Cardew wasn't founded by some respectable businessman. It was founded by a whiskey smuggler named John Cumming and his wife Helen, up on Mannock Hill, chosen for that exact spot specifically because the peaty local water made for exceptional whiskey, and the farmers who lived there had long supplemented their meager income with illegal, off-the-books distilling. John and Helen Cumming were used to operating right on the edge of the law. And Helen, not John, is the one who became a genuine local legend for outwitting the government's excisemen, again and again and again. Picture this. The farm sat high on a hill with a clear line of sight down toward the road. Whenever Helen spotted the authorities coming, she would throw flour on her arms and clothes and claim, completely straight-faced, that she was simply baking bread, while behind her the actual still was being frantically dismantled and hidden. She'd break the equipment down, drag it out the back door, and get a pot of stew going on the fire specifically to mask the smell of fermenting mash. And it gets bolder still. When excisemen were actually billeted at the Cummings farm during official investigations, Helen didn't hide. She cooked them dinner, and while they sat there eating her food, she slipped out the back door and raised a red flag on a pole, a warning signal to every other illegal distiller in the valley that the taxmen were in the area. She was caught 3 separate times over the years. But because the authorities of the time simply could not believe a woman was capable of masterminding an operation like this, they charged her husband John instead, all 3 times. There's a whole essay to be written about what that says about the era, but for our purposes here, it's just remarkable. The woman who arguably did the most to build the foundation of what would later become the heart of the Johnnie Walker blend, spent years as, legally speaking, an invisible criminal, because nobody in power could imagine a woman running the operation. When the Exile Act of 1823 finally made legal distilling realistic and viable, the family jumped at the opportunity, and Cardew was properly licensed in 1824. Decades later, the distillery passed to Elizabeth Cumming, Helen's daughter-in-law, who rebuilt it on new ground and tripled its production capacity. And in 1893, Elizabeth Sharp, deliberate and clearly her mother-in-law's successor in every sense, negotiated the sale of Cardew to John Walker and Sons for £20,500, a figure reportedly double the distillery's actual assessed worth, on the condition that her own family would continue running the day-to-day operations. She even secured her son a lifetime seat on the Walkers' board of directors as part of the deal. So here's the thing that I find genuinely thematically rich about this whole story. The thing that ties John Walker's beginning to the brand's eventual foundation. This entire empire, built on the idea of quality nothing in the market shall come before, was assembled piece by piece out of exactly the kind of raw, off-the-books, rule-bending survivalist ingenuity that built it in the first place. A grieving teenage grocer figuring out blending because the formal system offered him nothing. A farming family distilling in secret because legal channels offered them nothing either. Two completely different stories, born from the same pressure. When the system doesn't hand you a path forward, you improvise one. And if you're good enough at it, decades later, the world buys the bottle without ever knowing your name. By the early 20th century, the Walker family, now several generations deep, had a genuinely global whiskey business on their hands, and it needed a face. In 1908, George P. Walker and the company's managing director, James Stevenson, decided the brand's marketing needed an overhaul, and they approached a famous illustrator named Tom Brown to design a new mascot. The story goes, and it's one of those legends that's almost too good to fully verify, that Brown sketched the very first version of the striding man right there on a restaurant menu during that same meeting. From 1909 onward, the company's existing whiskey range was renamed under a completely new trademarked identity, Johnnie Walker. Old Highland became White Label. Special Old Highland became Red Label. Extra Special Old Highland became Black Label. And here's the part that gets me every time I think about it. The man depicted in that top hat, monocle and riding boots, striding confidently forward, cane in hand, every inch the picture of a Victorian gentleman enjoying life to its fullest, was, in spirit, modeled on the very idea of Johnnie Walker himself. The brand's own materials put it best. At a stroke, John Walker, the Victorian grocer, became Johnnie Walker, the Edwardian dandy. Think about the irony sitting quietly underneath that sentence. The real man, the actual John Walker, was a sober, disciplined, grief-hardened Kilmarnock grocer who never drank the product he perfected. The character built in his image half a century after his death, striding across every bottle sold around the planet, became a symbol of leisurely, confident indulgence. The company took a man defined by restraint and turned him into an icon of enjoyment. It's not dishonest exactly, it's just one of history's better jokes. The teetotaler became the mascot for drinking well. Managing director James Stevenson also coined the marketing line that's followed the brand ever since. Born 1820, still going strong, technically referencing the year the grocery shop opened, not the whiskey itself. But nobody buying the bottle was ever going to check the fine print on that distinction. And honestly, the sentiment was true either way. The expansion after that came fast. By 1906 to 1909, John's grandsons had grown the range to 3 separate aged blends, 5 years, 9 years, and 12 years old, laying the groundwork for the tiered lineup of colors that still defines the brand's shelf presence today, from the everyday red label all the way up to the rare luxury tier blue label. In 1934, that consistency and craftsmanship earned the company a royal warrant from King George V himself, official royal recognition, a stamp of legitimacy that would have been unthinkable to the 14-year-old boy sweeping the floor of a flood-damaged grocery shop generations earlier. I want to end this somewhere a little more reflective, because I think the surface facts of this story, dates, bottles, sales figures, are honestly the least interesting part of it. Johnnie Walker eventually became the highest-selling Scotch whiskey on the planet, sold in almost every country in the world, moving the equivalent of over 223.7 million standard bottles a year. The Kilmarnock plant, where it was bottled for generations, once the largest bottling plant on Earth, finally closed its doors in 2012, ending a 190-year physical relationship between the brand and the town where it began. The bottles now come from elsewhere. The Walker family stopped owning the company outright a long time ago. It now sits inside Diageo, one of the largest spirits conglomerates in existence, alongside dozens of other brands that have nothing to do with a Kilmarnock grocery shop. And yet, every single bottle, no matter where in the world you buy it, still carries that 24-degree tilted label, a design decision made for legibility on a shelf a century and a half ago. Still carries that square silhouette, chosen not for beauty, but so more bottles could survive a rough sea voyage without shattering. Still carries the name of a man who died believing he ran a modest, healthy grocery business, not knowing his surname would eventually be printed on more bottles than almost any other name in human history. What actually built this thing wasn't a single flash of genius. It was a 14-year-old absorbing a shock no child should have to absorb, and responding to it with quiet, stubborn competence instead of collapse. It was a son who took his father's instinct and gave it formal shape and global ambition. It was a woman on a Speyside hillside, disguising a still as a bakery, protecting her neighbors with a red flag, while feeding tax collectors dinner with a straight face. It was a daughter-in-law shrewd enough to sell her family's life's work for double its worth and still walk away with a permanent seat at the table. None of them set out to build a global icon. They were mostly just trying to survive whatever had just landed on them: a dead father, a flood, an unforgiving excise law, a shrinking farm income, with whatever tools and cleverness they actually had. The brand, the bottle, the striding man in the top hat, all of that came after. All of that was other people in other decades dressing up survival and calling it style. So next time you see that bottle on a shelf, in someone's hand, in an ad with a man striding confidently into the sunset, I want you to picture something different instead. Picture a 14-year-old boy behind a grocery counter in a small Scottish town, doing his absolute best not to let his family fall apart, tasting nothing, trusting nothing but his own careful hand, one blend at a time. That's the real story behind Johnnie Walker. Not a legend. A kid who had no choice but to grow up, and grew up so well that 200 years later, the whole world is still, quite literally, still going strong on what he started.